Hey, well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to week number 5 for PPA 500, and welcome from beautiful, scenic Turlock, California, which is where I'm at, up by around the Modesto area. Um, Thank you again for accommodating this later start time for tonight. It allowed me to finish up the meeting I had and get back to the hotel and in plenty of time to make sure that we had this class because we have very few class meetings together, and so I don't want to miss one. I want to make sure that we have all the class sessions that we have scheduled. So thank you for being so accommodating this evening. Before we get started tonight, let me just do a few housekeeping items. First off, there's a fire alarm going off in the hotel. So I guess we'll just hopefully ignore that and hope that it stops ringing very soon. But um, I hope you can hear me, but I assume that is out in the hallway. So give me 1 second. Let me make sure that the hotel is not burning down, and then we'll get right back to it. Well, that was fun. Alarm's off, as you can tell. So I guess we can actually start class. That, like I said, in 23 years teaching here at Long Beach, that's the first time that's ever happened to me. So I apologize for that. But fortunately, the Turlock Fire Department got here and turned it off. So let's return to what we were talking about. And we were talking about the housekeeping items before we get into our material for tonight. Just some reminders. I graded all the midterm assessments. The midterm assessments, in a word, were excellent. I think everyone did a really nice job. All the grades were in the A and the B level. And let me go ahead and turn off my camera. I don't, after the fire alarm incident, I don't really have a whole lot of trust in the wireless here at the hotel. So I'm going to tread very lightly from a bandwidth perspective. But so very well done on the midterm assessments. Like I said, all the grades were in the A and the upper B levels. So I think everyone did a really nice job on those. Around the corner then, in 2 weeks, you then have your final assessment that is due a little bit more than 2 weeks. But so we're going to spend some time tonight going through the final assessment and just introduce you to the 5 scenarios on the final and making sure that everyone is in understanding in terms of what needs to be done on the final assessment. The final assessment is the same format as the midterm assessment. So you did such a good job on the midterm assessment. Just continue to do that on final assessment. I think everyone will be in really good shape. Next assignment that's coming up for you is Canvas essay number 4. And that's coming due then on Monday, March the 4th. And that one looks at this question of public administration as a discipline, and you'll develop an argument as to whether or not you believe public administration is a discipline, or if you feel it is a field of study in another academic discipline. Again, no right or wrong answers. I'll just be looking at how well you justify your answer. So that's Canvas essay number 4, which is due on Monday the 4th. And then on March 9th, Saturday the 9th, what would be our final session. And again, we'll see how we progress with the material tonight as well as next Wednesday. If we cover all of our material tonight and next Wednesday, then we may not need to meet on Saturday, March the 9th. We'll just have that as a due date for the final assessment as well as for Canvas essay number 5. Canvas essay number 5 looks at the policy analysis material that we are going to cover here tonight in class. In Canvas essay number 5, what you'll be doing is selecting a policy. The public policy you select to discuss can come from any policy area, so it depends on your area of interest, but it could be an environmental policy, a welfare policy, a housing policy, tax policy, whatever you happen to be interested in. You'll select the public policy. And then for that public policy, you'll think about how that policy was formulated and the decision-making models that were used in making that policy and formulating that policy. So that's the idea that we're going to have then with Canvas essay number 5. And also not just to describe here is the decision-making model that was used, but also is there another decision-making model that you think would be more appropriate? Now, when we talk about decision-making models, we're talking about the 4 different decision-making models that we will cover tonight as we talk about policy formulation. So those four models are rational comprehensive, incrementalism, mixed scanning, and garbage can model of decision making. So we'll be selecting one of those that best describes the formulation process for that policy that you selected. When you're thinking about these four different decision-making models, one of the things that you'll think about is, as this policy is being formulated, is this policy something that is brand new? Is this something that is much different than the approaches we've used in the past? If so, then you could very well be looking at a rational, comprehensive approach to decision making. However, if this policy is just kind of a marginal change to what we have always done and how we've always addressed that issue, then that's probably going to represent something more along the lines of incrementalism. If it kind of is a combination of the two, that's going to be a model we talked about tonight called mixed scanning. And if this policy came about because of some major event that occurred, like a terrorist attack or something like that, then it's probably going to be an example of what we call garbage can model of decision making. But we'll talk about all those four different decision making models as we go through our material for tonight. So that's Canvas essay number 5. That is due by midnight on Saturday, March the 9th. And then your final assessment is also then due by midnight on March the 9th as well. So let's take a few minutes. I know I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this, but I do think that it works well when we as a class go through the assessment so we all know what's on the assessment, what the expectations are. We did this with the midterm assessment, and clearly that worked well because everyone did very well on the midterm assessment. So let's do the same thing here then for the final assessment. So the final assessment, we have these 5 scenarios and then 2 questions related to each scenario. Scenario number 1 gets at the question of public employment and management of human resources. Public employment and management of human resources, those are topics that we will get to next week. So this is material that we'll cover beginning with the start of class next week. So in this scenario, you applied for a position with the United States Department of Veterans Affairs as a policy analyst in January. In March, you received notice that you have been advanced to the next round of selection and will be scheduled for an interview in early April. Finally, in late April, you are contacted again and an interview occurs on May 15th. During the interview, you are told the process is ongoing and you will be informed of the next steps within the next 6 weeks. In early June, your friend referred you to a job with a private sector marketing firm. You apply, are interviewed, and hired on the spot. You accept the position with the private firm and lament the lost opportunity with the Department of Veterans Affairs. In early July, the department contacts you with a job offer that you must politely decline because you have already accepted the job with the private marketing firm. Question 1A, why did it take so long for the hiring process to occur in the federal government? What are some of the differences in working for the public and private sectors? We'll get that information when we talk next week. Then in 1B, the evolution of hiring in the federal government has trended toward hiring people based upon their knowledge, skills, and abilities, as opposed to which political party they support. Please discuss the 3 main areas of public employment and the evolution of hiring from the late 1700s until today. What era of employment are we currently in? This is, again, information that we'll cover next week. We will talk about the 3 main eras of public employment: the era of gentlemen, the era of spoils, and the era of merit. And we'll talk about how those eras developed, what those eras meant for how we hire people to work as bureaucrats in the public bureaucracy. And then we'll talk about the transition from one to the next, and then what type of era we are currently in today. So the information you need for scenario number 1, you'll get the bulk of that information then in class next Wednesday. Scenario number 2, the maintenance department of the Department of Public Works maintains all public facilities within the city of Treetown. Treetown is a well-maintained community and prides itself on the cleanliness of its public facilities. However, as the city has grown over the past several years, the number of public facilities has as well. This has resulted in maintenance workers being asked to do more and often to complete work outside of their position descriptions. As a result, the maintenance workers bargaining unit, the union, has filed a grievance that the additional new work has changed the work conditions of maintenance employees. This grievance eventually makes its way into the collective bargaining negotiations, into collective bargaining negotiations, and management and the bargaining unit have been struggling to come to an agreement over the issue. The bargaining unit declares an impasse when it is apparent that no agreement is on the horizon. Question 2A, what impasse resolution processes are available to the bargaining unit and the agency? Please discuss the 3 primary impasse resolution options. Next week, we'll cover fact-finding, we'll cover mediation, we'll cover arbitration as the 3 primary impasse resolution options. And then 2B, if you were a new director for this agency and had to direct your human resources manager to correct the issues of employees working outside of their descriptions, what functions of human resource management should your human resource manager do? This is information in terms of the functions of human resource management, things like job analysis, job evaluation, position description, things such as performance evaluation. We will talk about all those functions next week when we talk about managing human resources. Scenario number 3 then looks at the management of fiscal resources, which is the last piece of information we cover in this class, which we will cover in the second half of class then next week. The city of Preble Heights is struggling with its budget. It uses a simple line item budget and typically increases expenditures each year in connection with increases in gross domestic product rates. Over the past 5 years, the city failed to complete its budget on time and struggled to balance revenues and expenditures. The city auditor found that many programs are inefficient and are not achieving their goals and objectives. Standard & Poor's and Moody's, and those are 2 credit rating agencies that rate the credit worthiness of municipalities. Both of these agencies reduced the city's credit rating due to these budget issues. As a city council member, you and your colleagues need to recommend a new budgeting format to try and alleviate these concerns. So question 3A, select and recommend a new budget format for the city that will address the concerns in the scenario. Next week, in the last half of class, we will talk about 4 different budget formats: line item budgeting, performance-based budgeting, program-based budgeting, and zero-based budgeting. If you want a little sneak peek at those 4 different budget formats, in our module for next week, I have provided links to examples of those 4 different budget formats. But for this question, you'll be selecting one of those new budget formats and recommending it for the city. Then in 3B, we're going to turn our attention to issuing debt in order to build capital projects and make capital renovations. So in 3B, the city's aquatic center needs renovation. Given the city's fiscal problems, it is clear that the city lacks the resources to complete the project without borrowing money. The aquatic center is open to citizens for lap swimming Monday through Saturday from 2 p.m. to 7 p.m. Citizens pay a $3 fee to use the facility, and 100 residents use the facility for lap swimming 200 days out of the year. The city also charges a $20,000 per year fee to the school district and swim club teams to use the facility for their practices. A total of 6 teams pay this fee. The operating expenses for the aquatic center amount to $180,000 per year. Since the city does not have the money to pay for renovations, it proposes a bond to cover the costs. Which type of bond would you recommend and why? So here we are going to look at the different types of ways in which governments borrow money. And the primary way they borrow money is by issuing what are called these bonds. We'll talk about different types of bonds next week: general obligation bonds, revenue bonds, double barrel bonds. What you'll be doing then is you will be selecting one of those types of bonds we talked about next week and then recommending it for this situation. Now, I provide you with a lot of details here so that you can get a general sense of the amount of revenue that the aquatic center generates each year versus the amount of expenditures that the aquatic center has. That's done for the purpose of helping you decide which type of bond you will select to recommend. And now all then makes sense next week when we talk about different types of bonds. Scenario 4, and this thing gets into some of the information that we are going to talk about tonight. The city of Preble Heights also has a unit known as the Economic Revitalization Department, otherwise known as ERD. ERD's primary task is to implement a policy known as the Urban Revitalization Initiative. The initiative provides cash grants to businesses who renovate the facilities and remain in urban areas as opposed to moving to other states. The primary beneficiaries of these grants are obviously business owners who are willing to stay where they are and continue to contribute to economic growth in urban areas of the city, primarily the downtown area. To be successful, the policy would need to provide enough grant money to offset the cost savings of potentially moving to other states and areas. Not all members of ERD are in favor of the policy goals and believe that it is not the role of government to influence business decisions. These employees have sometimes been accused of slow walking the grant applications to delay the payment of money to applicants. 4A, from a policy implementation perspective, utilize Pressman and Waldowski's implementation research to illustrate some of the barriers to successfully implementing this policy. Tonight, when we talk about policy analysis in just a minute, we will talk about the different phases of policy, such as policy formulation, policy implementation, and policy evaluation. When we talk about policy implementation, we will talk about the example of Pressman and Waldowski, their study, and what they said about some of these barriers for successful implementation. Then in 4B, drawing upon the four models of effectiveness, examine this scenario from the perspective of each of these models. How would each model define the agency's effectiveness in implementing this policy? After we talk about the role of public administrators in policy and then the role of public administrators in public programs, we will then turn our attention to talking about how we measure effectiveness in the public sector. And I'll introduce you to four different models that we can use for measuring effectiveness in public administration. What you'll be doing here in 4B is then you will be discussing those four different models and what those four different models mean for how we can measure effectiveness in this scenario. So the information for number 4 you will get this evening. And then scenario number 5 is our program evaluation scenario. It has been 2 years since Preble Heights renovated its recreation center. So it's currently in the process of trying to renovate its aquatic center. It previously had renovated its recreation center. The Parks and Recreation Commissioner, Julia Lopez, approached the council last year with a proposal to address juvenile delinquency in the city. The city has seen a rise in the incidence of graffiti and vandalism over the past several years. Ms. Lopez proposed creating a program of after-school sports offered free of charge at the recreation center. The after-school sports programs offer from 3 p.m. to 7 p.m. Monday through Friday and 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. on Saturdays. The goal of the program is to give youth something to do after school and deter them from engaging in acts of graffiti and vandalism. The program has been up and running for 1 year. You are a program specialist, and the city manager has approached you to create a program evaluation to evaluate the effectiveness of the after-school sports program. Question 5A, identify and discuss the primary independent variable, dependent variable, and control variables that you would use in your program evaluation. And we'll talk about how we develop these variables in a program evaluation this evening. Then identify and discuss the research design that you would recommend using to evaluate the effectiveness of this program. Again, we'll talk about different types of designs that we can use in program evaluation, their advantages and disadvantages, and situations where some may work well and situations where others may be more appropriate. So that's your program evaluation scenario. Again, that information you will get by the end of class tonight. So after class tonight, you'll have all the information you need to do scenarios 4 and 5. Then the rest of the information you need for the final assessment, you will then get in class next week, hopefully. So if we cover all that information then tonight and next week, then we won't have a need to have our Saturday class. And you can just take that time on Saturday to finish up Canvas essay number 5, as well as your final assessment. That's the goal. That's the hope. I can't guarantee it, but I do think that we have a really good shot of being able to just reserve Saturday for you to finish up your final assignments. Now, I know this took a few minutes to go through the final assessment, but I think it is important that we go through it as a class so you're familiar with it. It is available now. The link is available on our Canvas site, and you'll complete the final assessment the exact same way you did the midterm assessment. Concise answers, 1 to 2 paragraphs per question, certainly would be sufficient. You approach doing it the same way. You just click on the link, and then the file is there with the final assessment. Just put your answers directly into that file, save it, upload it, and submit it. And so it's the same type of ground rules we had with the midterm assessment. As you're working on the final assessment and thinking about it, if you have any questions about it, feel free to reach out to me, shoot me an email. I will be back in town, provided it doesn't snow on the Grapevine. I'll be back in town sometime late on Friday night, but I still will have access to email. If you need to contact me tomorrow I'm going to be a little bit out of the pocket because tomorrow is the day of the site visit where we have meetings all day long, all the way into the late evening. So I will be kind of away from my email for the entire day tomorrow. But when I do get back in town on Friday night, I'll be able to check all those emails and get right back to you to answer any questions you have. Okay. Okay, let me share out, unless it's already disappeared. All right, hold on 1 second. Let me reopen up my slides, wake them up again, and then I should be able to then share them out. There they are. Okay, let me share out the slides for our discussion of the roles of public administrators in policy analysis as well as program evaluation. So what we have done so far in the course is we have talked about the constitutional basis of public administration. We have talked about how we assure accountability and ethics. We've talked about the unique role of public service and how public service is different than working in the private sector. Now, in this last part of the class, we turn our attention to the functions of public administration and the types of things that public administrators and public organizations do on a daily basis. So in our first part of the discussion tonight, we're going to talk about the roles of public administrators in the policy process. Then we'll turn our attention to the roles of public administrators in implementing and evaluating public programs. Then we'll turn our attention to talking about how we know when these policies and these programs in our organizations are being effective. How can we define effectiveness so that we can better work toward achieving enhanced effectiveness in the public sector? So to start out here, when we are looking at public policy, it's important for us to make a distinction between what we mean by public policies versus what we mean by public programs. Now, in our MPA program, we have a standalone core course in policy analysis. That's PPA 670 that you'll be taking with Dr. Melissa Matthews, and that's coming up in a couple of courses. Then we also have a standalone required course in program evaluation. And that one is called PPA 696 Research Methods, and that's one that you'll be taking with Dr. Adam Butts. We in our program separate out the coverage of policy and programs. Not all MPA programs will do that. Some MPA programs will combine policy and programs within the same core course. We separate them out into separate courses because the methods that you use to analyze policies and the methods you use to evaluate public programs are somewhat different from each other. Also, the nature and purpose of a public policy may also be a little different than the nature and purpose of a public program. So when we look at the relationship between public policies and public programs, when we differentiate between them, the primary way in which we do that is when we look at policies, we're looking kind of from an umbrella approach as the overarching goals. And so we will have, let's say we have a welfare policy, and the ultimate goal of that welfare policy, as it was in the mid-1990s, was to move people from welfare to work. That is the ultimate goal of this welfare policy. And that was the ultimate goal of reforming welfare policy in the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act in 1996. So that's kind of overarching type of goal. That's the policy. Then the way in which we go about achieving those policy goals, the specific things that we are doing, the specific services that we are providing, those will come by way of what we call public programs. So those public programs are kind of like the stanchions. They're kind of like the pillars that hold up this public policy. So if our overall public policy goal was to try and move people from welfare to work, there are multiple ways in which we could do that. One way we could do that would be through a job training type of program. Another way we could do that could be from a child care type of program. Another way in which we could do that could be a resume preparation type of program. All those public programs are ways to achieve the overall policy goal, the overarching policy goal of moving people from welfare to work. So that's kind of the difference between a policy versus a public program. Public programs tend to be more specific and more directly measurable than public policies. Public policies tend to deal more at the more abstract construct level, whereas public programs deal more on the ground at here are the measurable indicators, here are the operational definitions for our variables. So the methods we'll use to evaluate a program may look a little bit different than the methods we use to analyze a public policy. But regardless of whether we're analyzing policies or whether we're evaluating public programs, there are roles for public administrators to play in both of those types of endeavors. So one of the primary things that public administrators and public organizations do is they are engaged in formulating and implementing and evaluating public policies. So when you take your PPA 670 course with Dr. Matthews, she will introduce you to here are the different phases of the policy process. You'll talk about things like policy formulation, you'll talk about policy implementation, and you'll talk about policy evaluation. So let's take a look at those three different phases of the policy process and what public administrators do in those three phases. So the first phase, policy formulation, is a phase in which we are designing the policy. This is where we are constructing the policy. But as we know from our discussion of John Gaventa from a few weeks ago and his discussion of the three different phases of power, we know that in order for an issue to be addressed with a public policy, that issue must first get on the formal decision-making agenda of a decision-making body. As we know in Gaventa's study, the coal mine owners were very effective at keeping issues off of the agenda of the Kentucky and Tennessee state legislatures, so no policies were being made regarding mine safety. There were some policies being made at the federal level, but policies were not being made at the state level. That's agenda setting. That's what Gaventa called mobilization of bias. So before a policy can be formulated, it must first then go through the agenda setting process and find its way onto the formal decision-making agenda. There's a very famous policy-making scholar by the name of John Kingdon, and one of his articles is in the classics textbook. Kingdon discusses the process by which an issue finds its way onto the decision-making agenda. And the way in which Kingdon envisions it is he says we kind of have this primordial soup out there of issues and problems that we're kind of aware that these issues and these problems exist. We're kind of aware of the fact that they probably need to be addressed, but they're kind of floating around out there in the general social consciousness in this primordial soup. But then something happens that pulls that issue from the primordial soup onto the formal decision-making agenda. And oftentimes what's going to happen is that you're going to have what he calls a policy window that opens. And so these problems will come into contact with proposals, and the political environment is right that then opens up this policy window that then allows this issue to make it on the formal decision-making agenda. When an issue gets onto or a problem gets on the formal decision-making agenda, then we are ready to discuss it. Then we are ready to formulate a policy to address that issue or that problem. But when we formulate these policies, we are inherently going through a decision-making process. We are making decisions about what is the proper, most appropriate solution to utilize in order to resolve or at least mitigate this problem. So when we do decision making, there are different ways in which we can make decisions. And the four different decision making models that we focus on here in PPA 500 are rational comprehensive decision making, incrementalism, mixed scanning, and the garbage can model of decision making. So let's look at each one of those decision making models, the steps we go through in each, and then talk about some of their advantages and their disadvantages. So the first one is one that I'm sure you've heard of before and you're familiar with, and it's kind of intuitive. It's the rational comprehensive decision-making model, what Charles Lindblom referred to as the root approach to making decisions. In the rational comprehensive decision-making model, the first step we do is we clearly identify the problem that we're trying to address and our goals in trying to solve that problem. So we have clearly defined goals and we have clearly defined problems, and we have agreement among a lot of decision makers about what those goals and what those problems are. We then go out there and collect all the information that is available on that problem. We'll collect all the information. So there's just not a little bit of information, just not a snippet of information. We'll collect all of the possible information. We'll then take all that available information and we will use it to identify means or solutions for solving those problems and achieving those goals. So we'll put together a full range of alternative solutions that we could then pick from in order to address this problem. It's a full range of alternative solutions because we've used all the possible information in order to generate that full range of alternative solutions. Then from that full range of alternative solutions, we will then select the best alternative solution, and that best alternative solution will then become the heart of our public policy. And that's how we then formulate these public policies. We formulate them by selecting the best solution to solve the problem that we are trying to solve. Now, clearly, the primary advantage of this is that it's very holistic. It's very comprehensive. The word comprehensive is right there in the title. It's a very comprehensive way of collecting all the information, using all the information to come up with the best solution. The problem associated with rational comprehensive, and there are a few problems. The one that you probably already thought of is that we're human beings. And when we are human beings, we're going out there collecting information. We have what Herbert Simon refers to as bounded rationality. There are limitations to just how rational we can be in making decisions. We don't have the cognitive abilities, we don't have the time, we don't have the resources to collect all the possible information that is out there. We just cannot do it with the bounded rationality of being human beings. Another criticism of the rational comprehensive approach is that we don't know all the consequences of a considered action. So we don't know if, say, for instance, we are trying to solve the problem of safety hazards associated with airbags. And we know that airbags can cause some serious injury. They can save lives, but they can also cause some serious injuries. So we come up with a solution, we develop a solution, and it's an alternative to the use of airbags. Well, it looks all well and good right now, but then we don't realize that 10, 15, 20 years down the line, the chemicals that we are using in this alternative to airbags will cause harm to the health of people who come into contact with this airbag solution. That's an externality, that's an unintended consequence that we could not possibly know today because we don't have the scientific ability to learn about it today. We may not develop that ability until 10, 15 years down the road. So it's impossible for us to know all the consequences of our actions therefore making it impossible for us to truly be purely rational, comprehensive in our decision making. So the alternative to rational, comprehensive decision making is incrementalism. And that's our second decision making model, and one that you probably run into before, and one you probably see your organization use on a daily basis. This idea of incrementalism comes to us from an author named Charles Lindblom. And actually, a little piece of trivia, I just learned tonight that Charles Lindblom is apparently a native of Turlock, California. So I'm in the city that gave birth to Charles Lindblom. But Charles Lindblom, with his theory of incrementalism, argues that we can never be purely rational for the following reasons. Number one, we're never able to clearly define the goals and the problems that we are trying to address. We're never going to be able to clearly define them. We're never going to be able to get everyone to agree to these problem definitions. Secondly, we have these limitations, this bounded rationality that Herb Simon talks to us about. So therefore, we cannot collect all the possible information. Instead, we collect as much information as we can, given our cognitive and our time and our resource limitations. So we're collecting only a subset of all the information that is out there. Since we're not collecting all the information, we're not able to put together a full range of alternative solutions. So instead, we put together a limited range of solutions. And then what we will do is engage in what Lindblom calls limited successive comparisons. We will compare solution A to solution B, and then solution B to solution C, and solution C to solution D. Then we'll go back and compare A to D and B to D, and so on and so on. Make those very limited successive comparisons. Our goal then is not to select the best alternative, because we may not have even thought of the best solution. Instead, we'll select the first appropriate alternative solution that works for us today. So we're not selecting the best, we're selecting the first appropriate alternative solution. And then we implement that alternative solution. So as you can see, it's a much more limited decision-making process. It's what Lindblom referred to as the branch approach to decision-making. So when you think about a tree, rational comprehensive is a root approach. You get to the actual root of the problem, the actual root of the tree. In incrementalism, you can never make it to the root of the tree. So instead, you're just dealing out there with the branches. When Lindblom wrote this article talking about incrementalism, he received a great deal of acclaim. People thought it was the greatest thing since sliced bread. Lindblom was shocked by all the awards he won, because Lindblom said he wasn't developing a new theory. All he was really doing was explaining how public organizations actually make decisions. He said, I'll just explain what goes on a daily basis in these public organizations. The advantage of incrementalism is obviously it's much more limited, it's much more practical with our time and resource and cognitive limitations. The problem with incrementalism is that we're just going to make small, incremental, marginal changes from year to year in our public policies. We'll never have the occasion to go back and fundamentally rethink these policies and reformulate them, and perhaps even get rid of a policy and replace it with a brand new policy, because we don't have that much information to be able to do that under incrementalism. If you deal with public budgets on a daily basis, you know that incrementalism is the decision-making model that carries the day in public budgeting. We tend to take what we did last year, make an incremental change to that, and that then becomes the amount of money that we are spending for our next fiscal year. So those are two alternative decision-making models that we can use in policy formulation. Well, they're kind of diametrically opposed. You got rational comprehensive on one side of the spectrum, you have incrementalism on the other side of the spectrum. So there's got to be something that combines the two. And there is something called mixed scanning. Mixed scanning is a decision-making model that comes to us by this author named Amitai Etzioni, which is a wonderful name, I like to say, Amitai Etzioni. And Etzioni argues with mixed scanning that we will combine rationality and incrementalism. So for our big decisions, we will be as rational as possible. For our small decisions, we will try and be more incremental. So big decisions rational, small decisions incremental. The advantage is it makes sense because it allows for us for those small decisions not to waste time and effort being rational. We can kind of just look at what we did last year and then make a small incremental change. But if we're dealing with something very big, such as a brand new building, constructing a new recreation center, that's going to cost us tens of millions, maybe over $100 million, and that's going to last for generations, we want to try and be a little bit more rational and really put a lot more time and thought into making that decision. What's the problem? What's the criticism with mixed scanning? Big issues are rational, small issues are incremental. What's the problem with that? Any ideas?
I think for me, what comes to mind, I guess it would be what's considered a big issue to someone and what's considered a small issue to someone. So then some might not know how to approach it unless you have something to determine what's big and what's small, and then just kind of get a little, you might have a little bit of a confusion there.
Perfect. Absolutely. I couldn't say it better myself. That it's very subjective. That, what's a big issue versus what's a small issue? What's a big issue for one person may be a small issue for someone else, and vice versa. So there's a lot of subjectivity that's built into that determination. And that is the primary criticism of mixed scanning. As I mentioned before, though, we do see mixed scanning in terms of things such as something like capital budgeting. And so next week, when we talk about budgeting, we'll differentiate between operating budgets and capital budgets. Operating budgets that are used for the daily, day-to-day types of functions of an organization, and then capital budgets that are used for things like construction of new buildings and buying a new fleet of police vehicles, these very high price tag, long lifespan types of items. In operating budgets, we tend to do those relatively incrementally. And we can do that because you look at how many staples or paper clips you bought last year, and then you'll make a small adjustment to that and then use that for your estimate for this year. You can do that for small types of issues and be incremental. However, when we want to build a building, we are going to have a capital improvement plan, which will probably be a 5-year capital improvement plan. We will then put those projects into capital budgets. We'll spend a lot of time talking about which projects we should fund, how we should go about funding those projects, how we should go about constructing those projects. And we'll spend a lot more time, collect a lot more information, and be a lot more rational in the way in which we decide those capital projects. When I was on the board, we had a $148 million bond issue that we passed to do renovations and modernizations of our 15 different school sites. And before we spent that money, we spent a lot of time putting together a master facilities plan. We put together what's called an education specifications document, where we went through and looked at the specific building specifications for each one of those different facilities. That education specifications document was informed by what we call cluster groups. So we put together cluster groups of community members, board members, administrators, parents, and in some respects, students as well from upper grades into those cluster groups that then provided information that informed that education specifications document. We put months and months worth of work into determining which projects would be ranked higher on our capital improvement plan and how we would then fund those projects. So that's a very rational type of approach to decision making, much more so than with a daily operating budget. So I think budgeting, the difference between operating budgets and capital budgets, I think that's really a good example of mixed scanning. But you can use mixed scanning in those situations because it's relatively obvious what's a small and what's a big issue. But as was said, for a lot of other issues, it's much more subjective. What's big to one person may be small issue for someone else. Then our fourth decision-making model is my personal favorite, and that's garbage can model of decision-making. I love the model. I love the logic that underpins the model, but I really hate the title of the model. Because garbage can model kind of makes you think you're just throwing everything into a garbage can, you're mixing it up, shaking it up, and what you get is what you get. That's not the way in which it works. There's a lot more rhyme and reason to garbage can model of decision making. Garbage can model decision making is kind of similar to the John Kingdon approach to agenda setting that we talked about a few slides ago. In garbage can model decision making, policy decisions are made and policies are formulated at the confluence of four different, what the authors call streams. So when these four different streams all flow together at the confluence of these four different streams, that's when we tend to make decisions in public policy. That's when we tend to formulate our public policies. So those four different streams are the participant stream, the problem stream, the solution stream, and the choice opportunity or triggering event stream, what John Kingdon referred to as the policy window. So in the participant stream, in order to make a big change to a public policy, we need to have decision makers in decision-making positions who are predisposed to making big changes, who are willing to take those risks and make big changes to the way in which we are addressing a problem or an issue. So you have to have the quote unquote right decision makers in place. The second stream is the problem stream. So we've got all these problems that are floating around out there that we kind of have a general social consciousness of, but one of those problems will eventually pull itself out of this problem stream and will then come into contact with the decision makers who are ready to address it, which then comes into contact with the third stream, which is the solution stream. And in the solution stream, we have solutions, possible solutions to those problems. Now, this is where the garbage can model decision making gets kind of fun. Rational, comprehensive, incrementalism, they were both linear decision making models, whereby we identify a problem and then we come up with a solution to address that problem. So in rationality and incrementalism, the problem predated the solution. Here in garbage can model decision making, solutions can actually predate the problem. So we can reach back decades ago and we can select a solution that was generated many years ago to address a different type of problem, and then take that solution and apply it to the problem that we want to address today. I like to kind of refer to it as the Quentin Tarantino model of decision making. If you're a fan of Quentin Tarantino movies, you know that they tend to be relatively non-sequential and that they bounce around all over the timeline. And this is kind of like what's going on here. Solutions may predate problems. So an example of that, going back to welfare reform in the 1990s, that's an example of a policy where the solution predated the problem. The solution was the use of a block grant. And so we were replacing categorical grants like AFDC grants with much more general block grants known as temporary assistance to needy family grants. Those TANF grants were block grants. We didn't create block grants in 1996. Block grants have been with us for many decades, used for other things, all the way back into the New Deal. We were using block grants. So we took a pre-existing solution, applied it to a present day problem. Then in garbage can model decision making, those three streams will then flow together with what's called a choice opportunity stream, or some type of triggering event that occurs. That triggering event occurs that galvanizes public opinion and really pushes public opinion toward the idea of we need a different, novel way of approaching this problem or this issue. And sometimes I hesitate to call it a choice opportunity stream because a lot of these triggering events are very negative in nature and they can be very catastrophic types of events. Things such as September 11th was a triggering event that then caused us to rethink Homeland Security policy and ended up changing Homeland Security policy through the creation of a Department of Homeland Security, a TSA, all these limitations placed upon your ability to fly. Eventually, the creation of this thing called the Real ID Act, where states all had to follow federal requirements for what they include in their state-issued IDs in order for those state-issued IDs to count toward air travel. We then had the requirement for passports if you want to travel to Mexico and Canada. And believe it or not, back in the day, you didn't have to have a passport to go to Mexico or Canada. You could just cross the border and go. Now you need to have those. You have to have those types of passports. That's all part of the Bush administration. Came out of the events of September 11th. Let me give you one concrete example that I think illustrates garbage can model decision pretty well in terms of policy formulation. And that is the value jet crash back in 1996, I believe it was. So what we had is we had this value jet flight number 582. And unfortunately, it crashed into the Florida Everglades, killing over 100 people. The problem that caused the value jet to crash was that there was a fire that had broken out in the cargo bay of the plane, and the crew was unaware that there was a fire in the plane until it was too late. The fire had already burned through the electronics and had made the plane unrecoverable, and there's nothing the pilots could do. And unfortunately, it crashed into the Florida Everglades. So, in terms of garbage can model decision making, in order to make a change to this policy of airline safety, we had to have the right people in place. So we had consumer rights groups who were really outraged, obviously, at the crash of ValueJet 582. We had members of Congress who knew that they had to make a decision very quickly to try and keep this from ever happening again. So you have participants in place who are predisposed to make a change to the way in which we address the policy. The problem here in airline safety was one that was pretty easy to understand. We were not able to detect the fire in the cargo bay of the plane until it was too late. The solution that was chosen was one that pre-existed this crash of ValueJet 582, and it was smoke detectors. And we had smoke detectors long before 1996, but we took a pre-existing solution, we applied it to a present day problem, and the reason why we were able to do that, the confluence of these streams, they were all brought together by this triggering event, the crash of ValueJet 582. So I think it's a pretty good illustration of how these four streams all flowed together, which then led to the reformulation of this aspect of airline safety policy, the requirement to include smoke detectors in the cargo bay of all planes. So I like garbage can model decision making. I think it makes a lot of sense. It's pretty appropriate for a lot of the big changes we make to our public policies. We don't just make big changes to our public policies just out of the blue, out of thin air. Because to make a big change to your policy is probably going to cost you some political capital if you're an elected official. It's not going to be easy. It's probably going to be a relatively painful process. So there has to be some public support behind it, and oftentimes some type of a triggering event that will then give you the political capital that you need as an elected official to make these oftentimes very expensive types of changes to our policy approaches. Now, for public administrators, as we know from our previous discussion in accountability and ethics, we know that public administrators have a role to play in policy formulation by providing advice to policymakers in terms of these possible solutions, the practicality and the cost of these solutions. We know that they play a role in terms of helping to set the agenda. So public agencies can actually approach Congress and say, here is a problem that we are encountering on a daily basis. This is something that needs to be addressed and corrected, and can then help push that issue onto the formal decision-making agenda of Congress. So you've got a lot of roles here for public administrators to play in policy formulation. That's why we said when we talked about Woodrow Wilson, the politics administration dichotomy, that there's broad agreement that the politics administration dichotomy is no longer as valid as it used to be in the late 1800s. We cannot separate out politics administration and say administrators only play in the administration pool and they're not allowed to play in the political pool. We realize that they do get involved in policy formulation. Now, these laws, these policies that are passed by a decision making body are oftentimes very vague and ambiguous. And as we've talked about in this class before, in order to get a majority to agree to a policy, chances are that policy has to be relatively vague and ambiguous. The more details you put in that policy or that law, the less likely you are to get agreement to pass it. So we've got a lot of vague laws and ambiguous laws coming out of Congress. It's then up to us as public administrators in the second phase, policy implementation, to execute and implement those laws. Implementation is difficult. Even if you had a very clear policy and a very well-designed policy, that very well-designed policy can still fail in the implementation phase. Because as we know, there are a lot of barriers, a lot of obstacles to successful implementation. When you take the 670 course, you'll look at some case studies and some examples of successful versus failed public policy implementations. One work that I'm sure that you'll make mention to is the work by these authors, Pressman and Wildofsky, Jeffrey Pressman and Aaron Wildofsky. And their study of the implementation of a federal policy in Oakland, California in the 1970s was kind of the classic approach to studying policy implementation. So I would argue that it's the most important study that we still have today in the area of policy implementation. And so what Pressman and Wildofsky did is they wanted to follow the implementation of this federal policy in Oakland, California, to identify the obstacles that made implementation difficult and oftentimes less than successful. What they did is they identified several different issues, several different obstacles that can make implementation fail. Those obstacles are listed there on the screen for you. The first one, multiple goals. When we have a policy that has multiple goals that have been identified, the more goals we're trying to achieve, oftentimes the less successful we are going to be. Not only is it a problem to have a multitude of goals, but it's a problem when that multitude of goals come into conflict with each other. When they come into conflict with each other, we don't know as administrators which goal we are supposed to favor, which goal we are supposed to achieve as compared to the other goal. The more decisions that policy implementers need to make, the less successful implementation will be. And it just kind of stands to reason that the more decisions your implementers are making, the different ways they can make those decisions. And if you've got all these implementers making these decisions in different ways, chances are you're going to have less successful implementation. How much intensity does the implementer have in terms of favoring or opposing this policy implementation? If we have implementers who are very strongly in favor of this policy, then we're going to have a better chance of implementing it. If we have implementers who are very strongly opposed to the policy, then obviously, commonsensically, it's going to be much more difficult for us to get that policy successfully implemented. The amount of bargaining that happens with implementation. The more bargaining there is, the less successful implementation tends to be. If you have implementers who have to bargain with each other or have to bargain with citizens or have to bargain with federal agencies, then it introduces a lot of ambiguity into how it's being implemented. And you can have it implemented in one way in one area and implemented a completely different way in another area. One favorite strategy of the federal government when they're trying to implement a federal policy is to create a new federal agency. They'll create a new federal agency and then they'll try and flow implementation through that new federal agency. Well, the problem with that is sometimes these new federal agencies come into conflict with existing state agencies. And the state agencies feel that the new federal agencies are stepping on their toes, that they're stepping upon their turf. And then you end up getting fights between the existing state agency and this new federal agency designed for the sole purpose of implementing this new federal policy. But of all those issues, the one that Pressman and Wildofsky really pointed out as the most problematic is this idea of the intensity of the implementers. And I apologize why this is a little bit fuzzy here on the screen, but in this table, it just gives you this really simple 2x2 table looking at the direction of preference of the implementer. Are they positively inclined or negatively inclined toward the policy? And then how strongly positive are they? How strongly negative are they in terms of their intensity? So as we said, the best situation to be in for implementation is the top left-hand cell. You have implementers who are highly supportive of the policy. In those situations, you'll have very minimal delays. You'll have no bargaining. Basically, the policy will be implemented as it has been envisioned. It will be implemented effectively and efficiently. The worst case scenario is a cell below that, where you have very strong negative feelings on the part of your implementers toward the policy. That's when you have maximal delays. That's when you have a whole lot of bargaining and bargaining over the very essentials of the policy itself. Then the kind of gray area you get into is when you have more low intensity, so low positive implementers. You'd have minor delays, but really no bargaining, so it would still get done, just get done a little bit slower. If you have implementers who oppose the policy but not very strongly, you'll have more moderate delays. You'll have some bargaining, but not over essentials. You'll have bargaining over the margins, over the peripherals, over the details. So the best case scenario, obviously, is that you have implementers who strongly support the implementation. Again, very commonsensical, but still a very important theory in policy implementation. This whole idea of having your implementers have a positive feeling and a positive view of the policy is something that informed the research of a very famous public administration scholar by the name of Martha Durthick. And I like to introduce Martha Durthick in a lot of my classes. So when we take intergovernmental relations, we're going to read a couple of different articles by Martha Durthick. When we talk about organization theory in 660, we'll talk about Martha Durthick again. But Martha Durthick argues that in order to get our implementers to strongly and positively support policy implementation, the most effective way to do that is to involve them in formulation. So if your implementers are involved in putting this policy together, they will have a vested interest in the success of this policy. They will have some sunk costs, if you will, from an economic perspective in this policy. So they will want to see it be successfully implemented. It's important that you involve your implementers in formulation. So our second phase then was implementation. And then after the policy has been implemented, then we move into our third phase, which is policy evaluation. And in policy evaluation is when we're obviously going to look at the policy to see, is the policy achieving its stated goals and objectives? How effective is this policy at achieving its goals and its objectives? The purpose here in evaluation, obviously, is to generate that information about effectiveness and then feed that back through the policy process back in the policy formulation. So if we see that the policy is not being effective at achieving its goals, that's important information to feed back then into policy formulation. We either need to redesign, reformulate the policy, or we may need to abandon the policy and replace it with something that will have a better chance of achieving its stated goals and objectives. The problem with evaluation is that public policies, their outcomes, oftentimes do not occur immediately. The outcomes of a policy may take some time before they manifest themselves. So one problem we run into in policy evaluation is we sometimes try to evaluate policies before they are ready to be evaluated. If you evaluate a policy too soon, you're not going to be able to properly evaluate it because the outcomes have not happened yet. So there's this process in policy evaluation known as evaluability assessments. And it may sound strange, but essentially with the evaluability assessment, we are evaluating how ready that policy is to be evaluated. So we want to see, does that policy have measurable outcomes that are ready to be evaluated? A lot of these policies, those outcomes aren't going to manifest themselves for 6 months or 9 months or 12 months or maybe 2 years. If we try and evaluate it too soon, we're not going to be able to properly evaluate that policy. We know in the public sector, we conduct a lot of audits. We do a lot of audits of our public policies in order to see how well they are achieving their stated goals. If you've lived through audits before, and we'll talk a lot more about audits when we get to next week and talk about public budgeting, but if you've lived through audits before, you know that there are two primary types of audits. There are financial or legal audits, and then there are performance or management-based audits. In financial or legal audits, we ask the question, how are we implementing this policy? How are we spending the money to implement this policy? Are we spending the money? Are we implementing the policy in the legal ways in which that policy is supposed to be implemented? In a performance or management-based audit, we are asking the question, how well are we implementing the policy? And this is where we really get into the effectiveness of that policy. But we really need to do a good job in this third phase of evaluation so we can feed that information back into policy formulation so that we can reformulate the policy that is not working or perhaps get rid of it and replace it with a new policy. Now, those are kind of the highlights of the type of information that you will cover in PPA 670 policy analysis. Now, obviously, you'll get into a lot more granular detail about how you evaluate policies. You get in more granular detail about policy formulation and going through examples of how different types of policies get formulated. The process of formulating an environmental policy will consist of different stakeholders and different actors than the formulation process for taxation policy. And so you have different discrete sets of actors involved depending upon which type of policy is being formulated. But you're getting a lot of those granular details when you get into PPA 670. But we do know that obviously there are roles for public administrators to play regardless of the phase of the policy process. There are roles in formulation, there are roles in implementation, and then obviously there are also roles in the evaluation process as well for public administrators. So that's one of the primary functions we do in public administration is we engage in policy formulation, implementation, and evaluation. But the specific things that we do in order to achieve policy goals, those oftentimes happen within the parameter of these more specific public programs. So public administrators are also very much involved in the implementation and the evaluation of these specific public programs. So when we come back from break tonight, we will talk about program evaluation and we'll talk about some of the specific things that public administrators do in implementing and evaluating these public programs. And so we'll kind of give you a little foreshadowing of some of the information that you'll get in your PPA 696 research methods course. But let's take a little bit of a breakdown. Hopefully we won't have another fire alarm incident, but let's take a break. Let's say we'll take a break till 8:35. Come back at 8:35. We will do program evaluation, and then we'll move into a discussion of how we measure the effectiveness of policies and programs, and even the effectiveness of public organizations. And I'll introduce you to those 4 different models of effectiveness. And then I think that will probably be enough for the evening. We'll probably call it a night at that point, and then finish up with managing human resources and managing fiscal resources next week. So take a break, come back at 8:35, and we'll do program evaluation. Okay, we are back. It's 8:35, so let's go ahead and get into a discussion of program evaluation as another function of what public administrators do. And I'll turn off my camera for bandwidth. So far, so good with the hotel Wi-Fi, so I don't want to tempt fate, so I'll keep my camera off for a while. So we had identified the difference between public policies as these more general umbrella type policies with those more general goals. And then we identified public programs as kind of being the stanchions or the pillars that hold up those public policies, the much more specific types of programs that we are implementing on a daily basis in our organizations. Now, the information here in program evaluation will give you a little insight into the information you'll be covering in PPA 696 research methods. I think I'd already told you that our research methods course, even though it's called research methods, really does focus squarely on program evaluation. And the only reason why it's so called research methods is because of the somewhat cumbersome course approval type of process, and the content itself really is very much program evaluation, where we ask the question, how can we take classic social science research methods and place those in the service of evaluating our public programs? And so when we are dealing with program evaluation, we tend to be dealing at a much more specific level than we are with policy analysis. In program evaluation, we become much more quantitative. We become much more statistically inclined with the tools that we use with public programs, as opposed to analyzing public policies. And that's again because the outcomes, the outputs of public programs tend to be much more quantifiable and much more empirical. So the purpose of program evaluation is to apply these empirical methods to determine the effectiveness of a public program. So the one word there is empirical. We've talked about empirical in this class before. Empirical basically means information that is tangible, information we can collect, information we can analyze. It's information that's tangible enough that we can sense that information. It's information that we can collect and we can analyze, we can measure. That's what we consider to be empirical types of information. Empirical can include both quantitative as well as qualitative. Quantitative, as you know, deals with numbers. Qualitative deals with words. So we can use both quantitative as well as qualitative methods and consider both of those to be empirical in nature. When we combine qualitative and quantitative methods together, as you probably remember from your undergraduate research methods courses, that's what we refer to as a mixed methodology. So mixed methodology is very commonly used here in program evaluation, but our ultimate goal is to assess the effectiveness of a public program. So just like with policy analysis, here in program evaluation, we are assessing the effectiveness of the program at achieving its stated goals and objectives. Now, there are two basic categories of program evaluations that you will learn in 696. There are program impact evaluations and program implementation evaluations. So in a program impact evaluation, we are obviously looking at the impact of the program. We are looking at the relationship between the program and its desired outcome. Program implementation, we look at the process, daily process by which we are implementing that program to hopefully achieve those stated outcomes. We can obviously combine those two together, and we can do program evaluations that focus on both program impact as well as program implementation. But for our purposes tonight, we're going to focus primarily on program impact evaluations, because those are the primary types of evaluations that we tend to do. So how do we go about doing a program evaluation, and what roles do public administrators play in these evaluations? Well, most of these program evaluations are being done directly by public administrators. And so knowing how to evaluate the effectiveness of the program is really one of those central core competencies that every public administrator in a leadership or management position should have. That's why we have a 696 course as a required course in the program. That's why the skills you learn in program evaluation 696 are so elemental to the 5 universal required competencies that we are required to have as a NASPA accredited MPA program. So what we're going to do in program evaluation is we're essentially going to take all those tried and true methods from classic social science research, and we're going to utilize them and put them in the service of evaluating public programs. So you know very well from your research methods courses as an undergrad, you know that one of the first steps you do in coming up with a research project is to develop your research purpose and your research question. Well, here in evaluation, we have to develop an evaluation question. Evaluation questions kind of follow the same criteria and the same requirements as a good research question. So a good question should, number one, be clear. It should be clear to everyone so everyone understands what that question is asking. Everyone understands the terms that are used in that question. We need to have very clear evaluation questions. Secondly, our evaluation questions need to be answerable. Some things are not answerable with empirical information. You know, something like a belief, something that you have faith in, is not necessarily answerable with empirical data, because the whole idea of having faith in something is that you don't need empirical data in order to have faith that something is true. But for these evaluation questions, they need to be answerable with empirical information, and they need to usually have more than one possible answer. Well, why? Because if there's a question that only has one possible answer, chances are we probably know what that answer is. After 150 years of public administration literature, we probably know the answer if there's only one possible answer. So our evaluation questions should be clear, they should be answerable, and they should have more than one possible answer. So what does a basic evaluation question look like? Well, here are a couple of examples that, as I like to say, are ripped from the headlines. These are examples that come from a 697 research methods case that we used probably about a decade ago now. And that case study looked at a program evaluation of this program known as the Inmate Reading Intervention Program. So in this case study, we had an inmate reading intervention program that was designed to help inmates develop their literacy skills, which in turn would hopefully help decrease rates of recidivism. So the primary goal of the inmate reading intervention program was to try and decrease rates of recidivism, rates of reoffending. So a basic evaluation question could be, does the inmate reading intervention program decrease rates of recidivism? That is a very simple and very directional type of question, in that we're asking, does the program decrease rates of recidivism? So this is what we would call a one-tailed type of an approach, in that we are only allowing for the possibility that the program is going to decrease rates of recidivism. The possibility that increases rates of recidivism, that's not provided for in this type of a directional question. We could rephrase that question to make it non-directional in nature. How does the inmate reading intervention program affect rates of recidivism? This is a two-tailed type of an approach. And so we'll use this if we are not sure of the direction of the relationship between the program and its intended stated outcome. Now, when you took research methods to the undergraduate level, you were probably told that it's oftentimes better to ask how questions as opposed to is or does questions. How questions tend to generate more robust information, more detailed, nuanced, robust information than an is or does question. With an is or does question, it's a yes or no type of answer. It's binary. There's not a whole lot of answers to that question. When you ask the question, how, you then open the door to a lot of additional possible answers. Now, in program evaluation, we kind of loosen that advice up a little bit, and we do tolerate the does and the is type of question because we really do have very limited time and limited resources. And our ultimate goal here is oftentimes just to ask the question, how effective is the program? And so that oftentimes can be answered then with an is or a does type of question. When we ask these questions, we are asking questions inherently about the relationship between variables. And you know about variables from research methods at the undergraduate level. A variable is a phenomenon that may vary in value, that has the potential to change in value. If it has potential to change in value, it's referred to as a variable. If it lacks the potential to change in value, then it's referred to as a constant. Here we are looking at variables. Granted, when we get to statistical analysis, we will incorporate constants into our regression equations, but here we're looking at phenomena that can change in value. So we don't, like in research, we're looking for a relationship between our independent and our dependent variables. Here in program evaluation, typically our dependent variable, the variable that is being changed, is usually the result of the program. So rates of recidivism from our previous slide would be our dependent variable in that program evaluation. It's usually the outcome, the result of the program. Our primary independent variable is the variable that is affecting the dependent variable, that is causing the dependent variable to change. In program evaluation, this is going to be some measure of the program itself. So it could be something to the effect of it is participation in the program. So our primary independent variable could be binary, where we say, did someone participate in the program, yes or no? Thinking that those who participate in the program would end up reoffending at lower rates than those who did not participate in the program. We could be a little bit more nuanced than that if we want. And instead of just asking yes or no, did someone participate in the program? We could ask the question, how much or how often did they participate in the program? So we could ask the question, how many times per week did they participate in the inmate reading intervention program? Or even more specific, how many hours did they participate in the inmate reading intervention program? Alternatively, another way we can measure our program variable is we could do it through program existence. So we could ask the question, what are recidivism rates before the program was implemented versus what are recidivism rates after the program was implemented? So if we're looking at before the program was implemented for all those years before there was an inmate reading intervention program, we could score that independent variable as a 0 for each one of those years when the program did not exist. Then for all the years after the implementation of the program, we would score that independent variable as a 1 because the program existed at that point in time. That type of a longitudinal time series analysis would allow us to see differences in patterns in reoffending and recidivism before and after the implementation of the inmate reading intervention program. So this just underscores that there are a lot of different ways in which you can measure that primary independent variable. That primary independent variable, though, will be some measure of the program itself. Either program participation, program existence, it's some measure of that program. But our goal here in our evaluation is a causal type of goal, in that we are trying to isolate the relationship between participation in the program and the desired outcome. So in order to do that isolation between those two variables, we will have to control for other variables that could independently affect the likelihood to reoffend. So there are some other variables out there that could contribute to the likelihood to reoffend. Variables such as the type of crime committed. Was it a violent crime or was it a non-violent crime? We might want to develop a variable in terms of whether or not that crime involved drugs. If drugs were involved in the crime, we know that recidivism rates tend to be higher for those types of crimes than for crimes where drugs were not involved. Something such as you look at the education level of the inmate, and that could have an impact. Income level could have an impact. We may want to combine income and education together into socioeconomic status and use that as a control variable. But by controlling for all these other variables and kind of parceling them out of the equation, we can then isolate the true relationship between participation in the inmate reading intervention program and recidivism rates, the likelihood to reoffend. So again, we're kind of following the same parameters and the same logic that we would use in classic social science research. It's just that our primary independent variable is going to be some measure of the public program that we are trying to evaluate. Then another thing we have to do in our program evaluation is we have to decide what type of research design we are going to use. And when we're talking about a research design in program evaluation, we are talking about which subjects, who among our sample will participate in the program and who will not participate in the program. If you truly want to see the impact of program participation, it's always good to have that control group, that group of people who did not participate in the program, so you can compare the dependent variable for those who participated versus those who did not participate. So a really robust category of designs that is oftentimes used in social science research is this category of designs known as experimental designs. Experimental designs use random assignment. So we randomly assign some people to participate in the program, randomly assign other people to not participate in the program. Those who participate in the program in social science research we refer to as the experimental group. In program evaluation, we usually refer to them as the project group. So an experimental group in program evaluation is called a project group. And then the control group in research will be those who do not participate in the program, who are not exposed to the independent variable. In program evaluation, we call control groups comparison groups. So in our project group, these are people randomly selected to participate, randomly assigned to participate in the program. In our comparison group, these are people who are not participating in the program, and they are randomly assigned not to participate. So the basic experimental design is this classic experimental design you see there on the screen with the notation of ROXO, ROO. The R stands for random assignment. That means people are randomly assigned into one of these two groups. Randomness means that everyone has an equal non-zero chance of being picked. So everyone had an equal non-zero chance of being picked to participate in the program. That's what random assignment does for us. The O is an observation. So this is where we are collecting information on these participants and then collecting information on those non-participants. The X is participation in the program. This is when the independent variable is applied. So this is when the project group participates in the program. And then the second O is a post observation. This is collecting information after they participated in the program. So obviously what's going on here is a couple of things. The first thing is the R, the random assignment. By randomly assigning people to either participate or not participate, you have created equivalency between these two groups. So these two groups, because they are randomly assigned, will be equivalent in every way except the project group participated in the program, the comparison group did not participate in the program. The second thing you get from this is that you can then compare your project group post-observation to your comparison group post-observation. So since the only difference is participation in the program, if people in the project group have a statistically significantly different score than people in the control group, then we can surmise the reason for that is because of participation in the program. This has allowed us to isolate the relationship between program participation and the desired outcome of that program. And then you'll see there are some other groups, that other types of designs there that are all experimental in nature. Don't worry about those for this class. You'll get into those when you get to research methods. But for our purposes, we're interested in the broad category of experimental designs in which we use random assignment to determine who participates and who does not participate in the project or in the program. And then the second type is a quasi-experimental design. So if we are evaluating a public program that is an entitlement-based program, it is a program where people are legally entitled to benefits from that program. We cannot randomly decide who gets those benefits and who does not get those benefits. Everyone who qualifies legally for those benefits should be able to get those benefits. It would be immoral, it would be unethical, it would be illegal for us to deny benefits to people who are legally entitled to those benefits. Which is just one way of saying that it usually is impossible for us to use random assignment, an experimental design, in program evaluation of public programs. Since we cannot randomly assign and people are going to essentially self-select whether they participate in the program or they don't, our two groups, our project group and our comparison group, are no longer equivalent to each other because people are self-selecting. So those people who selected to participate in the program may certainly have different characteristics than those who chose not to participate in the program. We know that people who volunteer for things, people who apply for benefits, oftentimes have different characteristics than people who do not apply for benefits. So our job here in a quasi-experimental design as an evaluator is to ensure that our project and comparison groups are equivalent, even though we cannot use random assignment. So the way in which we do that in a quasi-experimental design is through the use of statistics. This is where we create those control variables. So we'll create control variables to measure our project group and our comparison group in order to try and make them equivalent. So some of our control variables could be things such as socioeconomic status. We'll measure the socioeconomic status of our project group and our comparison group. We may measure things such as their area of the city that they live in, their zip code, and may use that to try and create equivalency between our groups. But the moral of the story here is with quasi-experimental designs to create equivalency, we cannot do it through random assignment. So therefore, we do it through statistics and the creation of these control variables. Your program evaluation is only as good as the control variables that you create. If you don't create the right control variables, you're going to have something that's known as specification error, which means you have not specified the right variables to control. The whole purpose of having these control variables is that we can parcel them out of the equation so we can better isolate the true relationship between participating in this program and the desired outcome of the program. So participation in the inmate reading intervention program and its impact upon likelihood to reoffend in the future. So the most of the designs we use are quasi-experimental designs. It's relatively rare that we're able to use an experimental design. Now, in the natural sciences, they use experimental designs all the time because they have complete control over their quote unquote our experiments, our evaluations, we do not have complete control over. We cannot control who participates in the program. We can't even control when the program is implemented. The program's implemented whenever the enabling legislation says it's implemented. We as evaluators cannot withhold programs and then decide to implement them. We don't have that power and that authority. Another question we have to answer in program evaluation is, where will our information come from? Where are we going to source our information from? It would be ideal in a perfect world if we could collect our information from our entire population, everyone we are interested in studying. Chances are we are not able to do that because we don't have the time, we don't have the resources, we don't have the cognitive ability to collect information from an entire population. So as we know from research methods at the undergraduate level, we then create a sample. A sample is a subset of our larger population. Two different types of samples we can put together are probability samples or non-probability samples. Probability samples use random sampling. Non-probability samples do not use random sampling. So in a probability type of sample, there's an equal non-zero chance of everyone being included in selection for this sample. So everyone has a random, equal, non-zero chance of being selected. The important thing in choosing between probability and non-probability is obviously how interested are you in taking the results from your sample and generalizing those results to a larger population. If you want to generalize your results to a larger population, then your sample had better be very representative of that larger population. So you would want to use a probability type of sample. If you don't care about generalizing your results and you're just kind of taking a snapshot at this current point in time and you're not trying to generalize from the sample to the population, then you can get away with a non-probability type of sampling design, which is much cheaper, much quicker, and much easier to do. Usually in program evaluations, since we're trying to establish causation between participation in a program and the desired outcome, usually we are interested in probability sampling. So I've listed on the screen there for you 4 different types of probability sampling techniques. Simple random sampling, you take a list of your population, you number that list, you then use a random number generator to randomly select people or cases off of that list to then be part of your sample. It's simple random. It is by far the most representative sample that you can get because it is the most randomly chosen sample. Stratified random sampling, the second one you see there, is a variation on simple random sampling where we stratify or we break up our sample according to important variables. So say, for instance, you want to look at a program that's being implemented in a senior care facility. And the purpose of that program is to reduce the number of falls that these residents are having. So when you put together your sample of residents at this facility, you will stratify your sample according to those who fell and those who did not fall. That's called stratified random sampling. Sometimes you don't have the luxury of having a list of everyone, every case in your population. That's known as a sampling frame. Sometimes you don't have that list. And so if you don't have that list, a variation in probability sampling is what's called systematic sampling. In systematic sampling, since you lack a sampling frame, a list of people in your population, you'll use systematic sampling, whereby instead of using a list of people, you will just interact with people directly. So, an example, you've got a local public health clinic, and that health clinic is providing services on an anonymous basis. Since services are being provided on an anonymous basis, you do not know who is benefiting from those services. You don't know who is using those services. You don't have a list of patients. So what you'll do as an evaluator is you can position yourself outside of this local public health clinic, and then you'll interview every 10th person who comes out or every 20th person who comes out about the quality of the services that they're receiving in this health clinic. That's called systematic sampling. Now, it's not purely random, because by selecting every 10th person, it means person number 9 and person number 11 have an exactly a 0% chance of being selected. So it's not considered to be purely random, but it still has a random component to it. Then the fourth approach is what's called multi-stage cluster sampling. And this is a sampling design that we are pretty much in love with in program evaluation. The nice thing about a multi-stage cluster sampling approach is it's very good to use if you don't have a sampling frame, you don't have a list of the population at the unit of analysis that you need. So let's say we want to do an evaluation of a program that is targeted toward households. We do not have a list of all the households in the state of California. That list does not exist. So we have to try and create a list of households. So the way in which we do it is we would start at the county level. We would randomly select maybe 5 counties from the list of counties in California. Then from each of those 5 counties, we will then randomly select a list of cities from each one of those counties. Then from each of those randomly selected cities, we will then randomly select a list of neighborhoods. Then from each of those randomly selected neighborhoods, we'll select a random sample of streets within those neighborhoods. Then from those randomly sampled streets, we will then select a random sample of households that are located on those streets. So you can see it's multi-stage in nature, and that we are doing random sampling at multi-stages at different clusters. And at each cluster, the focus gets narrower and narrower. So you start at the county, then the city, then you go to the neighborhood, then you go to the street, then you go to the household. It's a great way in which we can create a sampling frame at the unit of analysis we need when one does not already exist. The Census Bureau, Bureau of Labor Statistics, a lot of federal agencies love to use multi-stage cluster sampling for their program evaluations. Then there are non-probability sampling designs, which do not include random sampling. So one example is convenience sampling. So I want to know what MPA students in the Cal State Long Beach MPA program think about PPA 500. So I ask all of you, because we're all sitting together here virtually on Zoom on a Wednesday night, and I ask all you what you think about the content of PPA 500. You're there, you're convenient to me, and that's why you're being surveyed. Does it mean that you are representative of everyone else in the DL MPA program? Maybe, maybe not. Are you representative of everyone in the stateside program? Maybe, maybe not. We don't know that. So we cannot generalize the results we get from tonight's class to everyone in the MPA program. Then there's what's called a snowballing technique. This is really good to use if you have hard to reach populations, such as people who lack affordable housing. So you want to interview these folks, but you don't know how to contact them because they don't have verifiable addresses. So you are lucky enough to be able to interview one person who is homeless. You then ask them to refer you to someone else, who then refers you to someone else, who refers you to someone else, and so on and so on. So through that referral process, your sample gets bigger and bigger and bigger, hence snowballing. Again, that's non-probability, so you cannot generalize your results to a larger population. So typically in program evaluation, when we want to generalize our results, which we usually do, we oftentimes want to use probability sampling and random sampling rather than a non-probability type of an approach. Once you've identified where your information is coming from, you've identified your sample, you then have to collect your data. Survey research continues to be more and more popular in program evaluation. It kind of is the staple of data collection in program evaluation today. We see it with cities. Cities do this all the time with their citizens. They want to see what citizens think about programs being provided by the city, so they'll send a survey out to their citizens. Survey research, you'll cover that in your 696 course, so we won't get into it in detail here, but you'll talk about how you write questions, you'll talk about how you sequence questions, you'll talk about how you develop response categories, you'll talk about different modes of delivery for your surveys in order to get the highest response rates possible. We'll talk about all those details of survey-based research in 696. Then we also tend to use a lot of secondary data. If a secondary data set already exists, we can use that data set in our program evaluation, but only if the unit of analysis for that secondary data set matches the unit of analysis that we are interested in. Then once we've collected our data, we need to analyze it. And as I said, in program evaluation, that usually involves the use of statistical analysis. So the type of statistical analysis that we are going to use will depend upon the purpose of our program evaluation. So are we just trying to simply evaluate the program in terms of how many people are using the program and which people are using the program? If so, that's very descriptive. We'll use our very simple descriptive statistics: mean, mode, median, standard deviation, variance, all those very descriptive measures of central tendency and measures of dispersion. Usually we want to go beyond that. And usually we want to use something more associational or causal in nature. Associational statistics will help us see the relationships between different variables. So if we have ordinal variables, we'll use our gammas and our Somers D's and our Kendall Tau B's. If we are doing interval level variables, we're going to use our Pearson's R. We're going to look at the relationship, the association between the program, participation in the program, and the desired outcome. But since we are looking at effectiveness, usually with program evaluation, we oftentimes are doing causal research, where we are asking the question, participation in the program, did it cause this intended result? Did it cause this outcome? So typically, most of our program evaluations consist of causal research. So that means we're going to have to use causal statistics. So this gets us into the realm of things like OLS regression, binary logistic regression, logit, probit, tobit, all these other more causal types of statistical techniques. And our program evaluations, the trend has been over the years that our program evaluations have become more statistically inclined, using more sophisticated statistics with each passing year. So our program evaluations have become very, very sophisticated and very statistical. And then based upon our statistical analysis, we will then use that to then arrive at our conclusions about the effectiveness of the program. The hope is that when we identify programs that are not being effective, that we will at the very least redesign and reformulate those policies. If we are finding policies that are not being effective, we may have to replace them with new policies. But as we all know, as public administrators, we operate in a political environment, which means that sometimes politics will trump the results of our program evaluation. So sometimes if there's enough political support for a public program, it's not going anywhere, even if it's not achieving its desired outcomes. Also, another problem with program evaluation that keeps us from effecting change in our public programs is that program evaluation is oftentimes starved for resources. We don't really have all the resources we certainly need in order to do our program evaluations. And that is because program evaluations are, for lack of a better term, not sexy enough. They don't provide the political benefits to elected officials that other types of appropriations will. And so when you get more political bang for your buck as a politician, funding a new bridge or funding a new recreation center, that's probably where your decisions are going to be made, as opposed to putting money toward program evaluation. So unfortunately, program evaluation is very much underfunded. And so we tend to continue implementing programs that are not achieving what we want them to achieve. But our ultimate goal here, obviously, is to measure these programs for the purpose of determining whether or not they are effective. Effectiveness in the public sector is probably the primary topic over the past several decades. Just about all the reforms, or at least the majority of the reforms that we have made to the public sector, have been made for the purpose of making our organizations, our policies, and our programs more effective. The question that then begs is, well, what is effectiveness? Up to this point in time, we have used the term effectiveness to mean achievement of goals. So we'll say an organization is effective if it is achieving its organizational goals. We'll say a policy or a program is effective if it is achieving its intended and stated goals and objectives. That approach of saying something is effective is if it's achieving its goals is the first model of effectiveness known as the goal attainment approach. The goal attainment approach is by far the most common approach to measuring effectiveness in the public sector. Did we, or how well are we achieving our stated goals? But I want to point out to you that even though that is by far the most popular way of measuring effectiveness, it is not the only way to measure effectiveness in the public sector. And there are three other models that we'll talk about right now: the systems resource model, the participant satisfaction model, and the internal process model. So three alternatives to the goal attainment approach for measuring effectiveness. So to start with the simplest approach, the goal attainment approach that we're all most familiar with, it is the simplest approach because based upon the link between the stated goals of an organization, a policy, or a program, and how effective we think that organization, policy, or program is. The shortcoming in the goal attainment approach is that it's only concerned about the output side. It's only concerned about the outputs and the outcomes of these organizations, policies, and programs. Sometimes it's a little bit too simple of a way to measure effectiveness. One problematic aspect of the goal approach is that organizations have different types of goals. So in the strategic planning process, organizations will develop what they consider to be their official goals. An official goal is the long-term goal of that organization. So it may be a 5-year or 10-year long-term goal. Those are official goals. But then you'll also develop your shorter-term goals that are usually referred to as operative goals. The problem between operative and official goals is sometimes they come into conflict with each other. And the goal approach is not very good at considering conflict between your official and your operative types of goals. So it doesn't really distinguish well between different types of goals. So when you do have conflict between your goals and you're not able to rely solely on a goal attainment approach, a second approach to measuring effectiveness is the systems resource model. The systems resource model harkens back to our discussion last week of systems theory. And this idea that organizations and policies and programs operate within a unique environment. Effectiveness is measured by the ability of the organization or policy or program to exploit resources from said environment. So the more resources that organizations, for example, can get from their environment, can import from their environment, the more effective those organizations are considered to be. Now, in a systems resource type of model, you usually do these in a longitudinal manner. So you'll look at, say, an organization, and you'll look at the amount of resources that organization has. Then over time, you will measure what happens to those resources. Do we see those resources grow over time? Do we see those resources shrink over time? If resources are growing over time, the organization is obtaining necessary resources from its environment, then that's a measure of effectiveness for an organization. The helpful thing about systems resource model is it's one that can be used when we cannot use other indicators. So if we cannot settle on our goals, we can't use a goal attainment approach, then an alternative could be this systems resource type of model. So the goal approach, how well are we achieving our stated goals? And the systems resource approach, how well are we obtaining resources from our environment? And that's the measure of effectiveness. Then the third model is the participant satisfaction model. In the participant satisfaction model, we're defining effectiveness according to the ability of the organization, policy, or program to satisfy its key strategic constituencies in its environment. So this is, again, very similar to that city that does that citizen satisfaction survey. That is measuring the effectiveness of the city according to participant satisfaction. In our MPA program, we do student and alumni surveys. We usually do those every 2 years, sometimes 3, depending on COVID, but usually every 2 years. And in those surveys, we ask people how satisfied they are with different aspects of the MPA program. We're effective if we have high rates of student and alumni satisfaction. And we usually do have very high rates of satisfaction. In fact, on the one question we asked, the one that I think is most important is the question, how likely are you to recommend the MPA program to colleagues, friends, and family members? And we end up with people saying they're either very likely or likely. About 96 to 97% of students and alums are either very likely or likely to recommend the program to colleagues, friends, and family. That's a very high level of satisfaction. That's something we use as an indicator of effectiveness. One thing to remember with the participant satisfaction model is that you have key stakeholders outside the organization, but you also have key stakeholders within the organization. So when you're looking outside the organization, you're oftentimes looking at the satisfaction of beneficiaries, citizens who are using the benefits of the program or the organization. You're looking at elected officials and how satisfied they are and how much they support the program or the policy of the organization. Internally, when you're looking at participant satisfaction, your stakeholders are your employees. And so it becomes more of a human resources or human relations type of an endeavor. But we are effective if we are keeping our key constituencies satisfied. And then the fourth model of effectiveness is the internal process model. The internal process model looks internal to the organization at the internal activities of the organization and assesses effectiveness by finding indicators of organizational health or internal health and efficiency. So indicators such as a strong culture within an organization and a positive work climate is an indicator of effectiveness in the internal process model. Esprit de corps, a team spirit within the organization is again an indicator of organizational effectiveness in the internal process model. The amount of confidence, trust, communication between workers and management. Who gets to participate in decisions and where are decisions being made? Are they being made near information sources, regardless of where those sources are on organizational charts? In other words, the people who are doing the jobs on a daily basis, are they allowed to participate in decision making? How much sharing, horizontal and vertical, do we have of relevant facts and feelings throughout the organization or throughout the people who are implementing policies and programs? How about the rewards to managers for fostering performance, growth, and development of their subordinates? And overall, the interaction between the organization and its component parts, where any conflicts that occur over programs or policies or projects end up getting resolved within the interest of the organization itself. What all this boils down to is the internal process model defines effectiveness by these indicators of what we call organizational health. So it's kind of like that homeostasis with natural systems theorists, that steady state where the organization is in harmony with itself, everything is working together in the symbiotic relationship, keeping the organization alive and healthy. those are all indicators of the effectiveness in the internal process model. So just like we did with our definition of power a few weeks ago, we have now introduced a multi-dimensional definition of effectiveness. It can be determined through achieving goals. It can be determined through the amount of resources that you can obtain. It can be determined through how satisfied you're keeping your constituents. It can be determined by the harmony within an organization. Those are four different distinct ways in which we can measure effectiveness, but they are not mutually exclusive. In that you can certainly have multiple indicators of effectiveness, multiple models that you can use in measuring the effectiveness of a public organization, public policy, or public program. But this discussion of effectiveness is important because when public administrators are involved in managing and leading organizations, like we talked about last week, when they were involved in formulating and implementing and evaluating policies, when they were involved in formulating, implementing, and evaluating programs, they are doing it for the primary purpose of being as effective as possible. And every time that we go and try and reform the bureaucracy, we're usually reforming it to try and make it more effective. So it's important that we understand as students of public administration what effectiveness is and how we can measure effectiveness in the public sector. So all these things that we are doing as public administrators, we are doing in order to try and make these things as effective as we can possibly make them. Then in addition to the work and the roles that public administrators find themselves doing in managing, leading their organizations, that you'll learn more about in 660 with me in organization theory, in the policy process, which you'll learn more about in 670, and in program evaluation, which you'll learn more about in 696. They're also very much involved in managing resources, such as managing human resources and managing fiscal resources. Managing human resources, those are skills that you'll develop in 577 human resource management. Managing budgets and managing finances, those are skills you'll develop in PPA 555 public budgeting. So where we are then going next week is we'll move into a discussion of what public administrators do when they manage human resources and manage fiscal resources to give you that foreshadowing of your two remaining core courses, PPA 577 and PPA 555. So by the time we end our discussion next week, you'll have all the information that you need to do a good job on the final assessment, but you'll also have a little insight into all the other core courses that you'll be taking during your time in the DLMPA program, and that will then prepare you well. You know, where this course we're kind of hitting the tip of the iceberg, but it will then prepare you well for learning all the more granular details that you will learn in your future core courses. And then once we have understood all the functions of public administration, then we kind of really have understood what public administration is, who public administrators are, and what public administrators do on a daily basis. And then that should prepare you very well then as you then move into the remainder of your courses in the DLMPA program. And we got through all that by 9:30 and without the fire alarm going off again. So I guess we should all consider ourselves very, very lucky. I can guarantee you $1 to a donut with my luck that about 2:30 this morning, the fire alarm will go off again. So I'm really looking forward to that. But do you have any questions on this information that we have covered tonight? Or any questions about where we're going in the class next week? Because we are done as of next Saturday, March the 9th. This course is finished, and you'll then move on to your budgeting course on March 23rd, I believe it begins with Dr. Zhao, and you'll be moving onward and upward in the program. So any questions before we call an evening together? Okay. If not, then I will try and get this recording up on our Canvas site by tomorrow. Again, tomorrow's going to be a real crazy day. I've been doing these site visits for 13 years now, and it seems like they get crazier every single year. So I'm not going to guarantee that I can get the recording up tomorrow, but I will certainly get the recording up no later than Friday evening. So if you need to go back and review any of this information as you're working on the final assessment, the recording will be up there for you. Then remember, on Monday, the 4th, you have Canvas essay number 4 due. Then we have our Zoom session next Wednesday. And then next Saturday, the 9th, you have your final assessment in Canvas essay number 5 due by midnight on that day. Okay? All right, thank you very much for hanging in there. Sorry about the fire alarm, but thanks for hanging in there tonight. Hope you have a good remainder of your week, and we'll talk again then next Wednesday night. So thanks a lot, everyone. Take care.